91-year-old gets bullied by 4 thugs, but then he takes the ultimate revenge. The sound of crunching leaves underfoot was the only noise accompanying Arthur Miller as he walked down the quiet suburban street. The autumn air was crisp, carrying the scent of wood smoke and damp earth. His wooden cane clicked rhythmically against the pavement, a steady counterpoint to the soft rustle of the shopping bag in his other hand. The bag, filled with apples, bread, and a carton of milk, was light, but the years had not been kind to Arthur's once powerful frame. His steps were deliberate, his pace slow but steady, much like the life he led in this small neighborhood. Arthur was a familiar figure to most people in the area. His daily routines were as predictable as the sunrise. In the mornings, he could be found tending to his garden, pruning roses, or raking leaves with the care of someone who still appreciated beauty in the world. Afternoons were spent feeding the birds at a nearby park or sitting on a weathered bench, gazing at the children playing and the joggers passing by. Evenings were his time for quiet reflection, surrounded by the trophies and medals from his youth, relics of a life that seemed worlds away from the present. His home was modest, its charm lying in its simplicity. The walls were adorned with faded photographs, images of a younger Arthur standing tall in crisp martial arts uniforms, shaking hands with other champions, or holding gleaming trophies above his head. The largest of these photos hung above the mantel, showing a much younger Arthur in midair, delivering a perfect spinning kick to a training dummy. His body was lean, his stance powerful, and his expression fierce. The man in the photo was a stark contrast to the one who now shuffled down the street, his back slightly stooped and his hands speckled with age spots. Arthur's martial arts days were a lifetime ago. Back then, he was known as the Hurricane, a name earned for his devastating speed and precision in the ring. His skill was legendary, his discipline unmatched. But time, as it always does, had taken its toll. Injuries accumulated, reflexes dulled, and eventually, Arthur retired, trading his championships for a quieter life. On this particular day, as Arthur made his way home from the corner store, he passed by the local park. The vibrant colors of autumn leaves carpeted the ground, and the air was filled with the distant sound of children laughing. Arthur paused for a moment, leaning on his cane to catch his breath. It was here that his peace was disrupted. "Hey, old man." The voice was loud, abrasive, and unfamiliar. Arthur turned his head slightly to see 4 young men lounging on the park benches near the sidewalk. They were dressed in leather jackets and faded jeans, their postures casual but their eyes sharp. One of them, tall with a shaved head and a confident sneer, stood up and approached Arthur. Arthur sighed inwardly but kept walking. He'd encountered people like this before, brash, looking for trouble, and eager to assert their dominance over someone they perceived as weak. "Where are you off to in such a hurry?" The young man called, blocking Arthur's path. "You in a rush to get home and watch your stories?" Arthur tried to sidestep him, but another thug, a wiry boy with a cigarette dangling from his lips, joined the first, cutting off his escape. "What's in the bag, old-timer?" the second one asked, his voice mocking. "Got some apples in there for us?" Arthur tightened his grip on the shopping bag but said nothing. His calm gaze flicked between the 2 men, assessing them with the quiet precision of someone who had faced far more dangerous opponents in his past. "Not much of a talker, huh?" the tall one said, grinning. "Let's see what you're carrying." Before Arthur could react, the tall man snatched the bag from his hand and appended it onto the sidewalk. Apples and bread tumbled out, rolling across the pavement. The carton of milk burst open, spilling its contents in a white puddle. "Oops," the man said, crushing an apple beneath his boot. "Guess you'll have to go back to the store." The other thugs, still lounging on the benches, laughed raucously. Their leader, Trent, looked back at Arthur, a smug grin on his face. "Say something, old man." Arthur's expression didn't change. He straightened his back slightly, his cane planted firmly on the ground. "You should leave before you do something you regret." The laughter stopped, replaced by an awkward silence. Trent's grin faltered for a moment, but he quickly recovered, stepping closer to Arthur. "What did you just say?" Arthur's voice was steady, calm. "I said you should leave." The other thugs got up from their benches, forming a loose circle around Arthur. The air grew tense, the playful mockery giving way to something more dangerous. "You think you're tough or something?" Trent asked, his voice dropping to a menacing growl. "You think you can talk to me like that?" One of the thugs shoved Arthur's shoulder, causing him to stumble slightly. The shopping bag fell from his hand, its soaked paper sagging. Arthur caught himself on his cane, his grip tightening. A neighbor across the street peeked out from behind their curtain but quickly disappeared, unwilling to intervene. Arthur noticed the movement but didn't call for help. Instead, he fixed Trent with a calm, unwavering gaze. "Enjoy your day," Arthur said simply, his tone unshaken. Trent barked a laugh, stepping back and kicking another apple into the gutter. "Crazy old man, let's go." The gang walked away, still laughing and jeering, leaving Arthur standing amidst the scattered remains of his groceries. He watched them until they disappeared around the corner, then knelt slowly to pick up what he could salvage. His hands trembled slightly, not from fear, but from the controlled effort it took to keep his emotions in check. As he straightened, his eyes briefly wandered to his reflection in a nearby storefront window. What he saw wasn't the frail, stooped man the thugs had mocked, but a flash of the warrior he had once been. His posture straightened slightly, and his grip on the cane became less of a crutch and more of a weapon in waiting. Arthur returned home, placing what was left of his groceries on the kitchen counter. He walked to the mantel, where his largest trophy stood gleaming under the dim light. His fingers brushed against its engraved surface as memories of the ring flooded his mind. "Not yet," he murmured to himself, his voice barely above a whisper, but the resolve in his eyes said something different. That night, Arthur sat on his porch, listening to the wind rustling the leaves. His cane rested across his lap, his mind quiet but focused. Somewhere in the distance, he could hear the laughter of the thugs echoing through the neighborhood. Arthur closed his eyes, remembering the words of his late sensei. "A storm always starts as a whisper. Be the whisper, Arthur, and let them underestimate you." The whisper had begun. The next morning, Arthur woke to the sound of birds chirping outside his window. For a brief moment, everything seemed normal. The sunlight spilled through the curtains, casting warm streaks across the room. He pushed himself out of bed, his joints stiff and aching, and shuffled toward the kitchen to make his tea. It wasn't until he glanced out the window while sipping the hot drink that he noticed something unusual. His garden fence, a structure he had built with his own hands decades ago, was defaced. Spray-painted in bold, jagged letters were the words, "Old Man." Instead of anger, a familiar calm settled over him, a calm that had once steadied his hands before a fight. Setting the mug down, Arthur walked outside to examine the damage. The paint was fresh, the crude letters dripping in places. Beside the graffiti, his trash cans had been knocked over, the contents scattered across his well-kept yard. He bent down to pick up the garbage, moving with the deliberate care of someone who refused to let small indignities fluster him. As he worked, he noticed a few neighbors peeking out from their windows. Their curtains twitched closed the moment they caught his eye. Arthur straightened up and glanced at the vandalism again, his expression unreadable. He knew exactly who was responsible: Trent and his gang. 4 boys who prowled the neighborhood like wolves, looking for easy prey. They had made a mistake targeting him, but Arthur wasn't one to react impulsively. He finished tidying the mess, grabbed a bucket of soapy water and a brush, and set to work scrubbing the graffiti from his fence. The thugs had expected him to be rattled, perhaps to lash out in frustration or fear. That would have been their victory, but Arthur knew better. He wasn't rattled. If anything, his resolve deepened with every drip of paint that faded under the brush's bristles. By mid-morning, the fence was clean and the trash cans were back in place. Arthur returned to his house, pausing at the doorway to glance down the street. He saw the gang loitering near the park, laughing and smoking, their casual demeanor masking their predatory nature. Arthur watched them for a long moment before stepping inside, closing the door with a soft click. That afternoon, Arthur's routine continued as usual. He walked to the park with his cane in hand, feeding the birds at his favorite bench. A mother with 2 young children passed by, offering a polite nod. Arthur smiled in return, though his thoughts were elsewhere. Across the park, Trent and his gang lounged on the playground equipment like kings surveying their kingdom. Their loud voices carried across the field, drawing irritated glances from the parents and joggers who tried to avoid them. Arthur sat quietly, observing them from a distance. He noticed the way Trent's arrogance seemed to fuel the group, how the other 3 boys, each younger and less confident, deferred to him. Trent was the alpha, and the others followed because it was easier than opposing him. As Arthur rose to leave, one of the boys noticed him and nudged Trent. The group's laughter erupted, followed by a mock shout. "Hey, Grandpa, got any more apples for us?" Arthur didn't look back. He kept walking, his steps measured and steady, but his grip on the cane tightened. He could feel their eyes on him, could hear their laughter fading as the distance grew. It wasn't anger that burned in his chest, but something colder. Determination. A reminder that bullies thrived on attention and submission. He wouldn't give them either. That night, Arthur stood in his living room, gazing at the largest trophy on his mantel. The polished metal caught the faint glow of the table lamp, reflecting fragments of his past. His fingers traced the engraved inscription, National Martial Arts Champion, 1972. The memories were sharp, as vivid as the day they were made. He remembered the roar of the crowd, the blinding lights of the arena, the exhilaration of landing the perfect strike. He remembered his sensei's words before every match. A calm mind is the strongest weapon. Use it, and you cannot lose. Arthur turned away from the trophy and walked to the window, looking out at the dark street. His yard was quiet, the fence unmarked, but he knew the peace wouldn't last. The gang had tasted blood, and they would come again. He glanced at his hands, now knotted with age but still steady. They had once been his greatest tools, strong, precise, and disciplined. Though the years had dulled their sharpness, they were far from useless. Arthur knew it wasn't just strength that won fights. It was control, strategy, and timing. And he had all three. The next day, Arthur woke to find another mess in his yard. This time, his trash cans had been dragged into the street, and the garden hose was slashed. A crude drawing of a stick figure with a cane was scrawled on the sidewalk in chalk, accompanied by the words, "You've seen Haigi." Arthur sighed, his breath visible in the cool morning air. He didn't feel fear, only the quiet certainty that the gang was running out of ways to provoke him. They wanted him to react, to fight them on their terms, but Arthur had no intention of giving them what they wanted. As he cleaned the latest mess, a neighbor approached hesitantly. Emily, a kind woman in her early 40s who lived 2 doors down, wrung her hands nervously as she spoke. "Arthur, I saw them last night. The boys, they were laughing about what they did. I wanted to say something, but I didn't know what to do." Arthur straightened, wiping his hands on a rag. "Don't worry about me, Emily. I can handle it." She frowned, glancing at the graffiti and the torn hose. "This isn't right. Someone needs to do something. Maybe we should call the police." Arthur shook his head. "The police won't stop them. They'll just be back tomorrow. Bullies don't scare easy, but they do get tired when their fun runs out." Emily hesitated, then nodded reluctantly. "If you need anything, just let me know." "I will," Arthur said with a small smile, though he knew he wouldn't. This was his fight, and he intended to finish it on his own terms. That evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Arthur sat on his porch, watching the street grow dark. His cane rested across his lap, and his eyes scanned the quiet neighborhood. The gang was out there somewhere, no doubt planning their next move, but Arthur wasn't worried. He leaned back in his chair, the weight of his years settling into his shoulders. In his mind, he replayed the lessons of his youth, the hours of training, the countless matches, the discipline that had shaped him into a warrior. Those lessons hadn't faded with time. They were as much a part of him now as they had been all those years ago. The shadows in the neighborhood were growing bolder, but Arthur was ready. He had waited long enough. Soon, it would be time to remind them that even shadows could be driven back by the light. With that thought, Arthur rose from his chair and stepped inside, closing the door softly behind him. The whisper of a storm was beginning, and Arthur intended to be the calm at its center. The following morning, the neighborhood felt heavier, as if the air itself was burdened by the escalating tension. Arthur went about his usual routine, but he noticed subtle changes. Fewer neighbors were outside. The children who usually played on the sidewalk stayed closer to their homes. The unease was palpable, a ripple effect caused by Trent and his gang's growing boldness. Arthur spent the day mending his slashed garden hose and reinforcing the lash on his gate. He had spent decades mastering self-control, but the increasing recklessness of the gang made it clear they wouldn't stop until something, or someone, forced them to. By mid-afternoon, Arthur decided to take a walk. With his cane in hand, he made his way down the familiar streets, the crisp autumn air refreshing against his skin. He stopped by the corner store, picking up a loaf of bread and a carton of eggs. As he approached the register, the young cashier, Lucy, offered him a sympathetic smile. "I heard what happened," she said softly, avoiding his eyes as she bagged his items. "Are you okay?" Arthur nodded. "Nothing I can't handle." Lucy hesitated, then leaned forward slightly. "They've been hanging around here too. Last week, they followed a custom route and slashed his tires. People are scared to say anything." Arthur placed a comforting hand on the counter. "Thank you for telling me, Lucy. Stay safe." The walk back home felt longer than usual. Arthur's thoughts were clouded with memories from his youth, times when he faced bullies both in and out of the ring. He had always believed in standing up to injustice, but he also knew there was a fine line between courage and recklessness. As he approached his house, Arthur noticed something was wrong. The front door was slightly ajar, the lock splintered and hanging loosely. His heart sank as he quickened his pace, stepping cautiously inside. The air inside felt colder, heavier, as if the house itself had been violated. His living room was a mess. Cushions were slashed, books were scattered across the floor, and drawers were left open. The photographs on his mantel were askew, and the largest trophy, the one he cherished most, was missing. Arthur stood in the center of the room, his eyes scanning the damage. He spotted a crumpled piece of paper on the coffee table and unfolded it. Scrawled in jagged handwriting were the words, "What are you going to do about it, old man?" Later that evening, Arthur sat alone in his kitchen, staring at the empty space on the mantel where his trophy once stood. The gang's taunts echoed in his mind. They had crossed a line. This wasn't just about intimidation anymore, it was personal. Arthur's gaze drifted to the attic door. For years he had avoided going up there, unwilling to revisit the artifacts of his past. But tonight was different. With a determined breath, he grabbed a flashlight and climbed the creaking wooden steps. Arthur pushed aside boxes of old photographs and yellowed newspapers until he found it, a weathered wooden chest. He knelt before it, his hands trembling slightly as he lifted the lid. Inside were the remnants of his former life. His black martial arts belt, frayed and faded, rested atop neatly folded uniforms. Beneath them were training manuals, worn from years of use, and a pair of sparring gloves that still bore faint stains from past matches. Arthur picked up the belt, running his fingers over the faded stitching. The weight of it felt familiar, comforting. Beneath the belt, he found a photograph of himself with his late sensei, Master Takeda. The two stood side by side, their expressions solemn but proud. Written on the back in Takeda's elegant handwriting were the words, "Strength is not measured by what you can take, but by what you refuse to give." Arthur's chest tightened as he remembered Takeda's teachings. His sensei had been more than a mentor. He had been a guiding force, instilling discipline, honor, and the belief that true strength came from within. Arthur placed the photo gently back into the chest and pulled out the gloves. He slipped them onto his hands, flexing his fingers. Despite the years that had passed, the movement felt natural, as if no time had gone by at all. The next morning, Arthur began his preparations. He moved the furniture in his living room to create a makeshift training area. He dusted off an old punching bag that had been stored in the basement, hanging it from a sturdy beam in the center of the room. With a deep breath, he began. The first punches were slow, hesitant. His body protested, his joints creaking with the effort, but Arthur persisted, each strike more precise than the last. His kicks followed, starting low and measured, then gradually rising in power and height. Flashbacks accompany each movement. He remembered the roar of the crowd, the exhilaration of landing a perfect strike, the pride of representing his dojo. But more than that, he remembered the discipline. The countless hours of practice, the sharp corrections from Takeda, and the quiet moments of reflection after each match. As the sun set, Arthur collapsed into a chair, his chest heaving with exhaustion. His body ached in ways it hadn't in years, but there was a fire in his eyes that hadn't burned this brightly in decades. That evening, Arthur ventured out, moving with the quiet precision of a predator stalking its prey. He scouted the streets, following the faint echoes of laughter and the acrid scent of cigarette smoke. It didn't take long to find the gang. They had claimed an abandoned house at the edge of the neighborhood as their hideout. Arthur observed from the shadows, noting their routines and interactions. Trent was clearly the leader, barking orders and reveling in his dominance. The others, Mike, a burly brute with a mean streak, Derek, a wiry boy who often hesitated before following orders, and Joel, the youngest and most eager to please, were his lackeys, feeding off his arrogance. Arthur watched as they tossed beer cans into the yard, laughing and shoving each other. They had no discipline, no strategy, only the recklessness of youth and the misguided belief that they were untouchable. Arthur's lips pressed into a thin line as he slipped away unnoticed. He now knew their patterns, their weaknesses, and he had a plan. The following day, the gang woke to chaos. Their bikes, which had been parked haphazardly in the yard, were all out of commission, tires slashed, chains severed. On the front door of their hideout was a piece of paper taped neatly in place. In bold, black letters, it read, "Respect is earned, not taken." Trent tore the note down, crumpling it in his fist. His face was flushed with anger as he barked orders, but the others seemed less certain. Derek glanced around nervously, his gaze flickering to the shadows as if expecting something, or someone, to emerge. "Whoever did this is gonna pay," Trent growled, but in his voice there was a hint of something new. Not anger, but fear. Arthur watched from a distance, his face calm but resolute. This was only the beginning. He wasn't just defending himself, he was sending a message. The night air was cool and quiet, carrying the faint rustle of leaves as Arthur stood in his backyard. In the center of the yard stood an old wooden post, its surface marred with dents and scratches from years of use. It had once been part of his training regimen, a makeshift substitute for the punching bags he couldn't always afford in his youth. Now it served as a reminder of his discipline, a relic from his past that had been waiting for its moment to come alive again. Arthur tied a strip of cloth around his right hand, securing his knuckles. His movements were deliberate, almost ceremonial, as he prepared to begin. He stepped back, taking a deep breath and closing his eyes. For a moment, he was no longer a 91-year-old man standing in a quiet suburban backyard. He was the hurricane, the young fighter who had made crowds roar and opponents tremble. His eyes snapped open, and he moved. The first strikes were slow, cautious. His fists connected with the wooden post in controlled bursts, each punch testing his muscles and joints. The impact sent small vibrations up his arms, and he adjusted his stance, shifting his weight onto his back foot for balance. Arthur's movements grew steadier with each hit, his confidence building. His hands remembered the rhythm, the way his fist should snap back after each strike. He threw a quick 1-2 combination, the second punch landing with a satisfying thud against the post. But as he increased the intensity, his body reminded him of its age. A sharp twinge shot through his shoulder, causing him to pause and rotate it slowly. He ignored the stiffness, stepping back and raising his leg for a kick. The first attempt was clumsy, his balance wavering as his foot connected with the post. He exhaled sharply, frustration flickering in his eyes. "Focus," he murmured to himself, the word carrying the weight of his sensei's voice. Arthur adjusted his stance, grounding himself more firmly. He visualized the motion in his mind, the fluid arc of the kick, the power generated from his core. He tried again. This time, his foot struck cleanly, and the post shuddered under the impact. A faint smile tugged at the corners of his mouth. The hours slipped by as Arthur continued his training. His strikes became sharper, his kicks more precise. He alternated between punches, elbows, and open hand techniques, his body relearning the language of combat. Sweat dripped from his brow, soaking the collar of his shirt, but he didn't stop. Flashbacks came unbidden, woven into the rhythm of his movements. He saw himself in the ring, his opponent charging forward with a wild swing. Young Arthur had ducked under the blow, spinning and delivering a devastating roundhouse kick that sent the man sprawling. The crowd had erupted in cheers, but Arthur had only nodded respectfully to his fallen opponent, his mind already focused on the next challenge. Those memories fueled him now, pushing him past the limits of his aching body. Every punch, every kick, every pivot was a step closer to reclaiming the strength that time had tried to steal from him. Arthur stared down at his trembling hands, the knuckles red and swollen. He flexed his fingers, feeling the old calluses beginning to return. Despite the pain, he felt a quiet satisfaction. His body might have aged, but his will had not, and it was will, he reminded himself, that won battles, not brute strength. As he walked back to the porch, his steps were lighter than they had been in years. He picked up his cane, but this time, it felt more like a weapon than a crutch. The following evening, Arthur ventured into his basement, a space that had long been neglected. The air was cool and stale, filled with the scent of old wood and concrete. He flipped on the light, revealing a cluttered room filled with forgotten tools and storage boxes. In the corner, buried beneath a tarp, was what he was looking for. He pulled back the tarp to reveal a punching bag, its surface cracked and worn from years of disuse. Arthur smiled faintly as he dragged it into the center of the room. He spent the next hour reattaching the chains to a sturdy beam, his hands steady despite the strain. When the bag was finally in place, he stepped back to admire his work. Arthur wrapped his hands with cloth strips and squared his stance in front of the bag. He began with slow jabs, testing the bag's weight and resistance. The sound of his strikes echoed through the basement, a rhythmic thump-thump-thump that grew faster and more forceful with each passing minute. Outside, the neighborhood was quiet, but a pair of eyes watched from the shadows. Emily, the kind neighbor who had always kept an eye on Arthur, had seen the light in his basement flick on. She had been walking her dog when she heard the faint sound of something heavy being struck repeatedly. Curious, she approached the house and peered through the small basement window. What she saw left her stunned. Arthur, the frail old man she had always known, was a blur of motion. His fists and feet moved with precision, striking the punching bag in rapid succession. Sweat glistened on his face, but his expression was one of intense focus. He didn't look like a man pushing 90. He looked like a warrior, fierce and determined. Emily stepped back, her mind racing. She had always admired Arthur's calm demeanor, but she had never imagined there was so much strength hidden beneath his quiet exterior. For a moment, she considered knocking on the door to ask what was going on, but something stopped her. There was a purpose in Arthur's movements, a resolve that she didn't want to interrupt. As she walked away, she couldn't shake the image of him from her mind. She didn't know what Arthur was preparing for, but she sensed it was something important, something that could change everything. Back in the basement, Arthur finished his session with a final powerful strike, sending the punching bag swinging wildly. He stepped back, breathing heavily but feeling alive in a way he hadn't in years. He sat down on an old stool, wiping his face with a towel. His body ached and his hands throbbed, but his spirit was unshaken. The thugs had underestimated him. They saw an old man, fragile and easy to target. What they couldn't see, was the years of discipline, the strength forged through countless battles, and the quiet fire that still burned within him. Arthur leaned back, his gaze fixed on the punching bag. He was ready, and soon they would know it too. The next morning, Arthur awoke to the familiar stiffness that came from a night of relentless training. His body protested as he swung his legs over the side of the bed, but his mind was sharp and his resolve unwavering. After a quick breakfast, Arthur stepped outside, taking a moment to survey the quiet street. The air was cool, and a thin mist lingered over the lawns. The neighborhood had settled into an uneasy rhythm, with people keeping to themselves and avoiding the gang whenever possible. The tension was palpable, but Arthur knew the storm hadn't reached its peak yet. He adjusted his jacket, grabbed his cane, and began his walk. It wasn't a stroll this time, it was reconnaissance. Arthur needed to know more about his adversaries, their patterns, their weaknesses, and the way they operated. If he was going to confront them, he needed to do it strategically. As he approached the edge of the neighborhood, Arthur's pace slowed. Across the street, Trent and his gang were gathered near an old abandoned house, their makeshift headquarters. Trent leaned against a rusted car, smoking a cigarette and laughing loudly, while the others huddled in a loose circle, tossing a battered football back and forth. Arthur found a shaded spot beneath a tree and leaned casually against it, appearing every bit the frail old man out for a leisurely rest. His sharp eyes, however, took in every detail. Trent was the alpha, his body language radiating arrogance and authority. He was taller than the others, his broad shoulders hunched in an exaggerated display of dominance. He spoke the loudest, barked orders, and was the first to act in any confrontation. Mike, the burly one, was Trent's enforcer. Arthur noted how Mike moved, heavy-footed, with brute strength in his arms but little grace. He relied on intimidation, his booming laugh often following Trent's commands like an echo. Joel, the youngest, was the eager follower. He fidgeted constantly, seeking Trent's approval with every action. Arthur could see the insecurity in the boy's movements, the way his eyes darted around as if afraid to be caught doing something wrong. Derek was different. Wiry and quiet, he hung back from the group, his posture less assured. Arthur noticed how Derek's laughter often came a beat late, as though it were forced. When Trent barked an insult at Joel, Derek's eyes flickered with discomfort before he quickly masked it. Arthur's gaze lingered on Derek. There was a spark of doubt in him, a hesitation that hinted at a conscience struggling beneath the surface. Arthur had seen it before, in opponents who stepped into the ring with bravado but crumbled when faced with true discipline. Derek wasn't beyond redemption, but he was still dangerous as long as he stayed under Trent's influence. Arthur watched as the gang grew bored with their game and turned their attention elsewhere. Trent gestured toward a parked car further down the street, and the group sauntered over. They surrounded the vehicle like vultures, laughing as Mike smashed the side mirror with his fist. Joel followed suit, kicking the bumper, while Trent and Derek spray-painted crude symbols on the hood. The sound of shattering glass drew a brief ripple of movement behind the curtains of a nearby house, but no one emerged to stop them. The gang reveled in their dominance, the absence of consequences emboldening them further. Arthur's jaw tightened, but he didn't move. Patience, he reminded himself. Bullies thrived on reaction, and he wouldn't give them the satisfaction, not yet. That evening, Arthur returned to the abandoned house under the cover of darkness. The gang had left for the night, their hideout quiet and still. He moved silently, his cane tucked under his arm as he stepped over broken boards and discarded beer cans. Inside, the house was as chaotic as the gang itself. Old mattresses and crates served as makeshift furniture, and the walls were covered in graffiti. A pile of stolen items, electronics, wallets, and even bicycles, lay in one corner, a testament to their reign of terror. Arthur crouched by the stolen goods, his sharp eyes scanning the pile. Amid the mess, he spotted something familiar, his missing trophy lying on its side, a fresh scratch mirroring its polished surface. He reached for it, his fingers brushing the cold metal, and a wave of determination surged through him. They had taken more than just a keepsake, they had tried to take his dignity. Arthur straightened, holding the trophy tightly in one hand. He glanced around the room, his mind racing. He wasn't just here to retrieve what was his. He was here to gather information. Over the next few days, Arthur fell into a routine of observation and analysis. He learned the gang's patterns, noting when they gathered, where they went, and how they operated. Trent's leadership was built on fear and loyalty, but there were cracks in the foundation. Joel's desperation for approval and Derek's hesitation were weaknesses Arthur could exploit. Arthur also noticed how they operated in the neighborhood. Their targets were random, sometimes a parked car, sometimes a garden gnome, other times a mailbox. The randomness wasn't a lack of strategy. Arthur realized it was deliberate. They were keeping the neighborhood on edge, never letting anyone feel secure. But their greatest weakness, Arthur knew, was their overconfidence. They believed they were untouchable, and they thrived on the assumption that no one would challenge them. One evening, as Arthur returned from his reconnaissance, he saw Emily standing in her front yard, her arms crossed and her expression concerned. She had been watching him closely in recent days, her curiosity piqued by his frequent outings and late-night activities. "Arthur," she called out as he approached, "can we talk?" Arthur stopped, his expression neutral. "Of course." Emily hesitated, then stepped closer, lowering her voice. "I know you've been keeping an eye on those boys. I see you walking near their house, and I saw your light on late at night. What are you planning?" Arthur's eyes softened slightly. "Nothing you need to worry about." Emily frowned. "You're not going to confront them, are you?" "They're dangerous, Arthur. The police should handle this." "The police have had plenty of chances," Arthur replied calmly. "They've done nothing. The boys think they own this neighborhood because no one has shown them otherwise." "But you're—" Emily stopped herself, her voice catching. "Arthur, you're not young anymore. You don't need to prove anything." Arthur's gaze met hers, steady and unwavering. "This isn't about proving anything. It's about doing what's right. If someone doesn't stand up to them, they'll keep hurting people." Emily's eyes glistened with concern. "Just please be careful." "I always am," Arthur said with a faint smile, "but thank you." That night, Arthur sat in his living room, reviewing the mental notes he had gathered. He knew their weaknesses, their routines, and their vulnerabilities. He also knew he couldn't confront them directly. Not yet. They were still too confident, too united under Trent's leadership. He needed to fracture their trust, sow doubt among them, and force them to make mistakes. The trophy sat on the mantel once more, polished and gleaming as if it had never been taken. Arthur stared at it for a long moment, his mind replaying the lessons of his sensei. A fight is not won with fists alone. It is won with patience, precision, and purpose. Arthur rose from his chair, his movements slow but deliberate. The shadows in the neighborhood had grown bold, but they were about to face a storm they couldn't see coming. And Arthur Miller was the eye of that storm. The morning was overcast, the gray sky casting a somber light over the neighborhood. Arthur stood by his window, sipping tea and watching the empty street. It was quiet, but not in a peaceful way. The air felt charged, as if the entire neighborhood was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. Arthur had no intention of waiting. The gang had pushed too far. They had made their threats personal, violated his home, and disrupted the fragile sense of security in the community. It was time for him to act, but he wouldn't do it recklessly. His days as a martial artist had taught him the value of strategy, of winning before the first punch was thrown. That was what today was about, striking the first blow without ever stepping into a fight. Arthur placed his cup on the counter, pulled on his jacket, and stepped outside. His cane was tucked under his arm, not because he needed it, but because it helped maintain the facade of the frail old man the gang believed him to be. His first stop was Trent's truck. The gang leader's black pickup was parked outside their makeshift hideout, its shiny chrome rims and loud exhaust system a clear symbol of his self-proclaimed dominance. Arthur walked past it, appearing to stroll aimlessly, before circling back when the coast was clear. He crouched by the rear tire, his movements swift but measured. From his pocket, he pulled a small, sharp tool and punctured the valve stem, releasing a steady hiss of air. He repeated the process with the front tire on the same side, ensuring that Trent wouldn't get far before realizing something was wrong. It wasn't a permanent sabotage. Arthur wasn't out to destroy property, but it would disrupt their plans for the day. Arthur straightened and walked away as casually as he'd arrived. Behind him, the truck sagged slightly on its deflated tires, the first step in what would soon be a day of inconveniences for the gang. His second target was Mike, the burly enforcer. Arthur had learned during his observations that Mike liked to stop by a particular corner store every morning for an energy drink. He also knew that Mike parked his motorcycle carelessly, often leaving it unattended and unlocked. Arthur waited by the alley across the street, watching as Mike swaggered into the store. The moment he disappeared inside, Arthur moved quickly. He approached the motorcycle, bent down, and removed the spark plug wire with a practiced hand. Without it, the bike wouldn't start. He tucked the wire into his pocket and retreated to his hiding spot. Minutes later, Mike emerged, holding his drink and looking around with his usual air of indifference. He climbed onto the motorcycle, turned the key, and tried to start it. Nothing happened. Confusion turned to frustration as he repeatedly attempted to start the engine, each failure drawing more attention from passersby. Arthur smiled faintly as he watched Mike eventually give up, cursing loudly and kicking the bike before storming off down the street. It was a small victory, but an effective one. By midday, the gang was starting to realize that something, or someone, was working against them. Trent stood by his disabled truck, shouting into his phone, while Mike sulked on the curb, glaring at his useless motorcycle. Joel and Derek arrived shortly after, their expressions a mix of confusion and unease. Arthur observed them from a distance, perched on a bench in the park. His posture was relaxed, his cane resting beside him, but his eyes missed nothing. He could see the tension growing among the group, the way Joel avoided making eye contact, and Derek kept glancing over his shoulder as if expecting trouble. The cracks in their unity were beginning to show. Arthur's next move wasn't sabotage, but information. Using an old flip phone he kept for emergencies, he made an anonymous call to the police. He reported suspicious activity at a specific address, the gang's hideout, and mentioned the stolen goods he had seen inside. He didn't give his name or linger on the call, simply providing enough details to warrant a visit from law enforcement. Sure enough, less than an hour later, a patrol car pulled up outside the abandoned house. Arthur watched from his vantage point as two officers knocked on the door. The gang, caught off guard, scrambled to hide their contraband, but the officers were thorough. Within minutes, they emerged with a bag of stolen electronics and a bicycle, much to the gang's visible frustration. Joel was the first to lose his composure. Arthur saw him gesturing wildly, his voice carrying across the street even though he couldn't make out the words. Trent silenced him with a sharp glare, but the damage was done. The gang was unraveling, their confidence shaken. That evening, Arthur delivered his final message. Under the cover of darkness, he approached the gang's hideout once more. This time, he carried a single piece of paper, folded neatly in his pocket. He tacked it to the front door with a small nail, ensuring it would be the first thing they saw when they returned. The note read, "Respect the people around you or face the consequences." Arthur retreated into the shadows, disappearing before anyone could see him. His heart raced, not from fear, but from exhilaration. It had been years since he had felt this alive, this purposeful. The gang had underestimated him, and now they were beginning to pay the price. The next morning, the neighborhood buzzed with whispers. Word had spread about the police raid, the disabled truck and motorcycle, and the cryptic note. Trent and his gang were seen pacing outside their hideout, their usual swagger replaced with a tense defensive energy. Emily approached Arthur as he tended to his garden, her expression a mix of concern and curiosity. "Arthur, have you heard what's been happening with those boys? Someone's messing with them." Arthur straightened, wiping his hands on a rag. "Oh, what sort of things?" "They've had their vehicles tampered with. The police showed up at their place, and now someone's leaving them notes. The whole neighborhood's talking about it." Arthur smiled faintly. "It sounds like someone's sending a message." Emily narrowed her eyes, studying him. "You wouldn't know anything about that, would you?" "Me?" Arthur chuckled softly. "I'm just an old man trying to keep his roses alive." Emily didn't look entirely convinced, but she didn't press further. Instead, she glanced down the street toward the gang's hideout. "Whoever's behind it, I hope they know what they're doing. Those boys aren't going to take this lying down." Arthur nodded, his expression calm but resolute. Sometimes people need to be reminded that their actions have consequences. By sunset, the gang was visibly on edge. Trent barked orders, his voice tinged with frustration, while Joel fidgeted nervously and Derek lingered near the edge of the group, his discomfort growing more obvious. The power dynamic was shifting, and Arthur knew it was only a matter of time before their unity fractured completely. As he watched from his porch, Arthur felt a sense of quiet satisfaction. The first blow had been struck, not with fists or violence, but with precision and purpose. He had disrupted their confidence, exposed their weaknesses, and planted seeds of doubt. But he also knew the fight wasn't over. The gang would retaliate. They had too much pride not to. Arthur wasn't afraid. He had spent years preparing for moments like this, and he was ready for whatever came next. For the first time in weeks, the neighborhood felt a little lighter. The gang's grip was weakening, and Arthur's quiet war was far from over. The night was dark and still, the kind of silence that amplifies even the smallest sounds. A rustling leaf, the distant bark of a dog, the low hum of wind. Arthur sat in his living room, the warm glow of a single lamp casting long shadows on the walls. His cane rested by his side, and his calloused hands cradled a mug of tea. He was calm, though he could feel the storm brewing just beyond his front door. He knew they would come. The gang had been humiliated, their confidence shaken. Arthur's carefully orchestrated disruption had backed them into a corner, and Trent's ego wouldn't allow the insults to go unanswered. He had studied Trent long enough to predict his moves. It wasn't a question of if they would retaliate, but when. Tonight, the air felt charged, electric with anticipation. Arthur had already prepared. He had rehearsed the layout of his home in his mind, every possible angle of entry, every shadowed corner where he could position himself. His living room, his kitchen, even the narrow hallway leading to the bedrooms, each space had been considered with precision. He wasn't waiting to be caught off guard. He was waiting to teach them a lesson. The sound of an engine broke the stillness. Arthur's ears perked up, his hand instinctively moving toward the cane. The rumble grew louder, joined by the faint sound of voices. He set the mug down and stood, his movements deliberate but unhurried. Through the curtains he saw them, Trent, Mike, Derek, and Joel. They approached his house like wolves, stalking their prey. Trent led the pack, his shoulders squared and his stride confident. Mike followed close behind, his bulk an imposing shadow against the streetlights. Joel fidgeted nervously, his eyes darting around the neighborhood, while Derek lingered at the back, his face unreadable. Arthur allowed himself a brief smile. They had no idea what they were walking into. The knock on the door was loud and aggressive, followed by Trent's voice. "Hey, old man, open up, we need to talk." Arthur didn't respond. He moved silently toward the hallway, positioning himself in the shadows. The knock came again, harder this time, rattling the door on its hinges. "Don't make us come in there," Trent shouted. A third knock, then silence. Arthur heard the faint sound of footsteps circling the house. He knew they were testing the windows, looking for a weak point. He had already reinforced the locks and added small, strategic barriers, simple measures designed to slow them down. Moments later, there was a crash as one of the windows shattered. Arthur's grip tightened on the cane, but he remained still, waiting. He heard the muffled voices of the gang as they climbed through the opening, their footsteps echoing faintly on the wooden floors. "Stay quiet," Trent hissed. "We don't want the neighbors calling the cops." "Are you sure about this man?" Joel's voice trembled. "He's just some old guy." "Shut up," Trent snapped. "He needs to learn his place." Arthur watched their shadows stretch across the walls as they entered the living room. He could see their movements clearly, the way they fanned out, searching for him. Mike picked up a framed photo from a side table, turning it over in his hands before tossing it onto the floor. Joel lingered by the doorway, clearly reluctant to go further. "Where is he?" Trent growled, his frustration mounting. Arthur stepped forward, his cane tapping softly against the floor. The sound drew their attention instantly. Trent turned, his eyes narrowing as he spotted Arthur standing in the doorway, silhouetted against the dim light from the hallway. Well, Trent said, a smug grin spreading across his face. "Look who decided to join us." Arthur didn't speak. He met Trent's gaze with quiet intensity, his calm demeanor unshaken by the gang's presence. The silence unnerved Joel, who took a step back, but Trent mistook it for weakness. "You got guts, old man," Trent said, taking a step closer. "But you've been a real pain in our ass. It's time you learned who's in charge around here." Arthur tilted his head slightly. "You came into my home," he said, his voice steady but firm. "That was your first mistake." Trent laughed, a harsh sound that echoed through the room. "Your home? This is our neighborhood now. You don't get to make the rules." Arthur's eyes flicked to Derek, who stood near the edge of the group, his posture tense but uncertain. Arthur could see the conflict in his expression, the hesitation in his movements. Derek wasn't fully committed to this, and Arthur intended to use that to his advantage. "You think you're in control," Arthur said, his gaze shifting back to Trent. "But you're just boys playing at being men." Trent's grin faltered, replaced by a flicker of anger. What did you say? Arthur took a step forward, his movements deliberate and controlled. Real men don't need to take what isn't theirs. Real men don't terrorize their neighbors or hide behind their friends. Trent's fists clenched, his bravado cracking under Arthur's unwavering calm. You got a big mouth for a washed-up old man. Without warning, Trent lunged forward, his fists swinging in a wide arc. But Arthur was ready. He sidestepped smoothly, his cane sweeping upward to deflect the blow. The momentum sent Trent stumbling, and Arthur took advantage of the opening, planting the end of the cane firmly against Trent's chest and shoving him backward. Trent crashed into the coffee table, sending magazines and a lamp scattering across the floor. Mike roared in anger and charge, his massive frame barreling toward Arthur. This time, Arthur didn't sidestep. He stood his ground, raising the cane and striking Mike's knee with precise force. Mike crumpled with a pained shout, clutching his leg as he hit the ground. Joel froze, his wide eyes darting between Arthur and the others. I don't think this is a good idea, he stammered, his voice shaking. Shut up and help, Trent barked, struggling to get back to his feet. Derek hesitated, his hands clenching and unclenching at his sides. Arthur turned to him, his voice calm but commanding. You don't have to do this. Walk away now and you can leave this behind. Derek's jaw tightened, his internal conflict clear. For a moment, it seemed he might step forward, but instead he took a slow step back, shaking his head. This isn't what I signed up for. Coward. Trent spat, but Derek didn't respond. He turned and walked out the door, leaving the gang behind. Joel dropped his makeshift weapon, backing away with his hands raised. I'm done too, man. This is crazy. Arthur's eyes shifted back to Trent, who was breathing heavily, his face twisted with rage. You're going to regret this, Trent growled, but the edge in his voice was gone, replaced by fear. Arthur took a step closer, his cane tapping lightly against the floor. No, Trent, you're the one who's going to regret it. With one swift motion, Arthur struck the cane against the floor, the sound reverberating through the room. Trent flinched, his defiance crumbling as he realized he was outmatched. Arthur didn't need to fight him any further. The lesson had been delivered. Get out, Arthur said, his voice low but firm, and don't come back. Trent glared at him, his chest heaving, but he didn't argue. He grabbed Mike, helping him to his feet, and the two stumbled toward the door. Joel followed, his eyes darting nervously between Arthur and the others. As the door closed behind them, Arthur stood in the silence, his grip on the cane relaxing. The confrontation was over, but the battle for the neighborhood's peace had just begun. Arthur wasn't finished, not yet. The morning after the confrontation was calm, but Arthur knew it was the eye of the storm. The gang wouldn't let the humiliation of the previous night go unanswered. Sitting in his kitchen with a fresh cup of tea, Arthur began organizing the evidence he had collected. Photos, videos, and notes documenting weeks of the gang's harassment. It was time to take the next step, rallying the neighborhood. Arthur called Emily, her dependable voice greeting him quickly. Arthur, is everything okay? Everything's fine, but I need your help. Can you come by? Emily arrived within minutes, her dog trailing behind her. She scanned his home, her brow furrowed. What's going on? Arthur handed her a flash drive. This contains everything I've recorded. Photos of vandalism, videos of them breaking into homes, and evidence of stolen property. We need to share this with the neighbors. People are afraid, but if they see the truth, they'll stand together. Emily hesitated, clutching the drive. Arthur, this could be dangerous. They're already on edge. They thrive on fear, Arthur said calmly. If we take that away, they lose their power. That evening, Emily helped organize a community meeting at the park. Word spread quickly, and by sunset, dozens of neighbors had gathered. There was nervous chatter as families, shop owners, and retirees shared their stories of intimidation and damage. Emily began, her voice steady. Thank you all for coming. We've all been victims of the gang terrorizing our neighborhood. But tonight, we're here to take a stand. Arthur stepped forward, holding a stack of photos and notes. For weeks, I've documented their actions. Vandalism, theft, intimidation. It's all here. He passed the materials around, neighbors murmuring in anger and recognition. A shop owner spoke up, frustration in his voice. They smashed my windows last week. I didn't report it because I thought no one cared. Another woman with a toddler chimed in. They threw rocks at my car. I was too scared to confront them. Arthur raised his hand, quieting the crowd. I know how it feels to be afraid, but if we stand together, they can't control us. The evidence we gathered will go to the police, but we also need to show them we won't be bullied anymore. Emily added, "We're forming a neighborhood watch, coordinating with the police and supporting each other. If we stay united, they lose." As the meeting progressed, the atmosphere shifted. People began sharing contact information, volunteering to patrol, and organizing repairs for damaged property. Hope replaced the fear that had hung over the neighborhood for weeks. The following morning, Arthur took the evidence to the police station. Chief Peterson, a stern but fair woman, reviewed the materials. "This is solid," she said, her voice firm. "We'll move quickly, but this could escalate things." "I understand," Arthur replied, "but they need to know their actions have consequences." By that afternoon, patrol cars circled the neighborhood, a visible sign that the gang was under scrutiny. Trent and his crew retreated to their hideout, their confidence shaken. As the sun set, Arthur sat on his porch, watching neighbors repair fences and paint over graffiti. The unity was palpable, a quiet resistance forming against the gang's reign of terror. But Arthur knew it wasn't over. Trent wouldn't back down without a final act of defiance. Arthur took a deep breath, the calm before the inevitable storm. He had set the pieces in motion, and the neighborhood was stronger than it had been in years. Now he braced for the next move, ready to protect the community he had fought so hard to unify. The neighborhood had transformed. The community's unity was visible in the repaired fences, clean sidewalks, and the quiet resolve on people's faces. Yet an underlying tension lingered. Arthur knew the gang was planning something. They wouldn't accept defeat easily. That evening, as the streetlights flickered on, he prepared himself for what he sensed was coming. Arthur stood by his window, watching the quiet street. He had spent the afternoon fine-tuning his home's defenses, not elaborate traps or weapons. He didn't need them. Strategic furniture placement and knowledge of the terrain were his tools. He wasn't looking for a fight, but if it came, he would be ready. The low rumble of engines broke the stillness. Arthur's sharp eyes caught the headlights of Trent's black truck leading a convoy of 2 motorcycles. They moved deliberately, stopping a few houses down. Arthur's pulse quickened, but his face remained calm. They were here, and he was ready. Trent emerged from the truck, his silhouette tall and imposing in the dim light. Mike, his hulking enforcer, followed, cracking his knuckles. Joel and Derek dismounted their bikes, lingering behind Trent. Joel looked nervous, his eyes darting to the shadows. Derek's face was harder to read, his posture tense but not aggressive. "Old man," Trent's voice cut through the night. "You've been real busy, haven't you? Stirring up the neighborhood, turning people against us. You think you're a hero?" Arthur stepped out onto his porch, his cane in hand, the streetlight casting a long shadow. "I'm not a hero, Trent. Just someone who won't stand by and let bullies like you win." Trent sneered, motioning for the others to follow as he approached. "You don't get it, do you? This is our territory now. We run things here." Arthur tilted his head slightly, his calm demeanor unnerving the gang. "If that's true, why are you standing here shouting at me? Seems like you're the one who's lost control." Trent's sneer faltered, replaced by anger. "You've got guts, I'll give you that. But it's time someone put you in your place." Trent lunged forward, his fists clenched. But Arthur was faster. With a swift sidestep, Arthur used his cane to sweep Trent's legs out from under him. Trent hit the ground with a grunt, momentarily stunned. Mike charged next, his massive frame barreling toward Arthur. This time, Arthur stepped into the attack, using Mike's momentum against him. A sharp twist of the cane struck Mike's knee, sending him sprawling onto the grass. Joel froze, his face pale as he watched his comrades fall. "I don't think this is a good idea," he stammered, taking a step back. "Coward." Trent spat from the ground, scrambling to his feet. "You're going to let this old man win." Arthur's eyes locked on Derek, who hadn't moved. "You don't have to do this," Arthur said evenly. "Walk away now, and you can leave this behind." Derek's jaw tightened, and for a moment it seemed he might attack, but then he shook his head, his voice low but firm. "I'm done." "What?" Trent's voice rose in disbelief. "You're backing out? You're just like the rest of them, weak." Derek ignored him, turning on his heel and walking away. Joel hesitated, looking between Trent and Derek, before dropping his weapon and following. Now it was just Trent and Mike, the former seething with rage, the latter groaning in pain on the ground. Arthur stepped forward, his movements deliberate but controlled. "You've lost, Trent. It's over." "Not yet." Trent roared, pulling a knife from his pocket. He lunged again, the blade flashing in the light. Arthur sidestepped once more, this time disarming Trent with a sharp twist of his cane. The knife clattered to the ground, and Arthur delivered a swift blow to Trent's shoulder, sending him staggering back. Trent fell to his knees, clutching his arm and glaring up at Arthur. "You think this changes anything? You think they'll respect you?" Arthur leaned down, his voice steady. "Respect isn't taken with threats and violence. It's earned through actions. That's something you'll never understand." The sound of sirens cut through the night. Trent's head whipped around, his bravado faltering as flashing blue and red lights appeared at the end of the street. Arthur straightened, his cane resting at his side. "You called the cops?" Trent spat, his voice tinged with panic. "No," Arthur replied. "The neighbors did. You see, Trent, the people here aren't afraid of you anymore." Police cars pulled up, officers stepping out and assessing the scene. Chief Peterson herself approached, her sharp gaze landing on Trent. Well, looks like we got a troublemaker." Trent glared at Arthur, his defiance flickering. "You think this is over?" "It is for you," Chief Peterson said, motioning for an officer to cuff him. "You're under arrest for assault, vandalism, and a whole list of other charges." Mike groaned as two officers helped him to his feet. "What about him?" Mike mumbled, jerking his chin toward Arthur. Chief Peterson smirked. "What about him? Seems like Mr. Miller was just defending himself." As the police drove away with Trent and Mike in custody, neighbors began to emerge from their homes. Emily was the first to approach Arthur, her face a mixture of relief and admiration. "You did it," she said softly. "We did it," Arthur corrected, gesturing to the neighbors gathering around. "This wasn't just my fight. It was all of ours." The crowd murmured in agreement, their unity stronger than ever. People began discussing ways to keep the neighborhood safe, from organizing patrols to installing better lighting. The shadow that had loomed over the community was finally lifting. Later that night, Arthur returned to his porch, the faint sound of crickets filling the air. The battle was over, but he knew the work wasn't done. The neighborhood still needed healing, and the scars left by the gang would take time to fade. Emily joined him, a cup of tea in hand. "You were incredible," she said, "but you shouldn't have had to do this alone." Arthur gave her a small smile. "No one should have to face bullies alone. That's why it's important to stand together." The quiet night felt lighter, freer, as if the neighborhood itself was breathing a sigh of relief. Arthur sipped his tea, content in the knowledge that the community he had fought for was finally reclaiming its peace.